Hi, buddy. Welcome to Talking Automotive with Mark and John. My name is John Sinclair and my co-host Mark Palavestra.
Hi, John. Today we go down the road of the various fuel types and the evolution, opportunities and threats that each one presents, not only to the new car side of the business, the used car side of the business, the automotive aftermarket and the disposal side, and ultimately the carbon footprint that each one either assists in reducing or maybe increases in other ways.
Yeah, this can be a huge risk to many businesses, and therefore it's well worth giving some sort of consideration to what that risk could be for your business and working out various scenarios of if that did happen, what would be the impact to my business before any type of investment's made. So well worth a listen.
If you like what you heard, subscribe to our channel, follow us on iTunes and Spotify, and follow us on our website, autocurrents.com.
So let's jump into it.
With 30 years' experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services is an independent division of Precar Services, offering specialty fleet fit-outs for commercial applications ranging from simple tray and tow bar fitments to fully bespoke service body and accessory installation. With quality-assured safety, compliance and standardisation of vehicle builds, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies, and original equipment manufacturers. For further information on how Precar Fleet Services can assist in solving your commercial vehicle fit-out needs, please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
Are EVs the silver bullet? Why doesn't Toyota invest heavily in EVs? Why doesn't the biggest car company in the world invest in EVs? What do they know that we don't know? Okay, John, we're going to talk about alternative fuels. So let's start with the fuels. If we talk about, where EVs are coming, it's inevitable. Let's start from the start. We have unleaded petrol. Unleaded petrol sales are declining year on year in this country, but diesel sales are maintaining. In fact, they've had a slight increase. So when we talk about diesel not being done yet, we'll get to that in a sec, but let's start with unleaded petrol and then the next version of fuel after that. So if we start with petrol, the unleaded petrol story is you have low displacement engines that are turbocharged. V8s are disappearing. In fact, there are only a handful of V8s and they're very much at the high performance end. We saw that in Silvio's discussion with the enthusiasts who love those V8s, but there's getting fewer vehicles for them to choose from. Whereas in the main, you've got low displacement petrol, fuel efficient, stop-start, so very economical and low carbon emission. But then we look at the next fuel that was a darling of this country going back 15 years ago, which was LPG. LPG has a lower carbon output than petrol. Downside is you need to use more of it, and it really works well for larger engines. We've seen the demise of large sedans that were fitted with LPG. So that fuel now is pretty much a defunct fuel or a fuel for old or aging vehicles. And the cost of putting an LPG system on those vehicles is just prohibitive because those systems in the last iterations were around $4,000. So it's a lot of money to retrofit to a vehicle. Given the higher resale values, it may be worth looking at again. I don't know. But in the main, LPG's finished. So then you go to the next fuel that was seen as an alternative fuel, which was diesel. Now, diesel, we've already done a podcast with RKLAB, and diesel is not done yet. Definitely not, because if you look at the diesel consumption versus ULP, diesel consumption in this country has maintained steady volume. In fact, it's had a slight increase since 2013. And that's because we've changed the vehicles that we drive. We drive SUVs, and the medium pickup is the best-selling car, the top 2 selling cars are medium pickups, and they are diesel. So diesel recreational vehicles are still the mainstay, which means that in the new car market, but that means in the used car market, they're going to be around for a long time. And there is scope to improve the efficiency of those engines with the technology of RKLAB. You then look at the other, moving on the journey to electrification, which is the hybrid. And Toyota have done a fantastic job in selling hybrid Priuses, Camrys, and now RAV4s to the point where their acceptance is better than an EV because you don't have range anxiety. It is an electric motor. There is a battery, but it's self-generating. So you don't have range anxiety as an issue with that, and you're not relying on a grid to charge up the vehicle. So your life is not disrupted. And that's what we talked about in our podcast where we asked the question, why would you want to buy an EV? And that gets us to EVs. Now, John, you mentioned some very valid points about EVs. So when we get to EV, there's the carbon footprint of the EV. And it's not only the footprint of driving it, it's the footprint of mining it, creating it, operating it, and disposing of it. Now, can you tell me more about your thoughts on that?
Well, Mark, what was really interesting, because I was involved in launching the EVs in Europe. One of the first countries was Norway, and I was involved in setting up the network in Norway. And I remember at the time there was a debate, what should they call the emissions, or what can they call it? And Nissan actually came up with the title zero emissions, because it was zero emissions coming out of the exhaust. They were very nervous to get in a debate about saying no emissions, so it was about emissions coming from the exhaust. There are zero emissions coming out of the exhaust, but to go and mine the rare earth metals to create and manufacture the battery and to manufacture the vehicle, while the vehicles will be the same whether it's for a petrol engine or an electric vehicle engine, there is still a lot goes into the manufacturing the battery and the emissions that are created out of that. So to really measure things properly, what we need to do is we need to look at it as a whole. You can't just take what the emissions are from the exhaust. You need to take it as for the emissions for the creation of the battery and for the emissions that create the actual vehicle, and then do a comparison, because that will give you a more realistic view of what emissions are being created. The second part of that, and where we haven't found, there's not a lot of solutions yet on it, but what happens to the battery at the end of life? Now, there has been talk about reuse and repurpose of batteries so that can maybe go into houses, but that will only take care of a certain volume of batteries. And then even once they've been repurposed into a house, it's only going to last for so many years. So say for example, a battery lasts 10 years in a car, gets repurposed, gets put in a house, and it lasts for another 10 or 15 years. What happens to that battery at the end of that 20 or 25 years? What are the emissions in trying to recycle all those elements and put that back into a way that can either be disposed of or recycled back into the creation of maybe a new battery or repurposed into some other form? That's why I think for electric vehicles, there is definitely a place for electric vehicles, but I think they're going to find it very difficult to have, say, all passenger cars replaced with electric vehicles, because the pure volume of batteries that are going to be coming back at the end of a 10-year period is so huge, and to manage that recycling, repurposing of all those batteries is going to be tremendously difficult. Now, we've even seen for tires. Tires remains a major problem for automotive manufacturing, and especially in the places like the US. There's huge piles of tires that no one knows what to do with. What's going to happen to those tires? It's the same challenge. What are we going to do with these batteries at end of life?
The question for you, John, is why, there's an organisation that I have the ultimate respect for, and I think they're an amazing car company, and that's Toyota. They're number one globally. They oscillate between Toyota and Volkswagen as who's number one, but Toyota do it from a long-term sustainable business model perspective. Why do you think Toyota has not gone down the road of, say, General Motors by saying we're going to electrify everything, we're not going to have any ICE engines, and we're not going to go, we're just going to put everything into this EV basket?
Well, I think a lot of the manufacturers, while they up front they're talking about putting everything, 100% going into EVs, a lot of them are still doing development work in the back door on ICE type engines or more efficient diesel engines. So there's a lot of other work going on. I don't think all of them have 100% everything into one basket and that everything is going to go to the electric vehicle. I could be wrong on it, but I think there's still a lot of development or a lot of work going on just in case things don't quite work out on electric vehicles. Because the other big challenge with electric vehicles is the rare earth metals. We already have major issues with semiconductors because semiconductors get used in mobile phones. There's a lot of areas where they're starting to get used, and there's already a shortage. And you're starting to find now that companies are starting to mine seabeds, which will have a major impact on the environment. If the demand really escalates, there's going to be even more damage to the environment, and it's going to push up the price of these rare earth metals. And where are you going to find those, and where do they need to be mined from? As the price goes up, companies will look for opportunities to make a buck and start mining areas that probably should never be mined. So it's something we need to think about, and what will be that impact.
And hydrogen? Where do you see the hydrogen fuel cell? Because Toyota have obviously they're investing in hydrogen. Is hydrogen is going to leapfrog the EV?
Well, I think things like hydrogen will definitely play a part. And that's what I'm saying. I think EVs will definitely be there, and there'll be a place for them. And there'll definitely be a place for hydrogen. But whether it's blue or green hydrogen, that's where the debate will come in, to make sure that it's green hydrogen. Because I believe blue hydrogen, there's still a lot of emissions and environmental damage in the creation of blue hydrogen. That's also going to impact where that goes.
And as far as user acceptance, that's something that we covered in our podcast when we discussed the idea of buying an EV and how does an EV fit into your lifestyle. Right now, we're accustomed to pulling up into a service station and within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, if you get a Mars bar and a coffee, you're in and you're out and you're back on the road. Whereas when we look at even with fast charging, you're looking at a longer period than that before you can be mobile again. How do you see the user acceptance, given that we have to plan our lives around making sure our vehicles have the appropriate levels of charge?
Well, I think user acceptance will improve over time. It's very expensive to try and retrofit a building or set up charging stations from scratch, especially if it's a large office block, put in all charging points. So that's going to be quite expensive. But any new building going up, they will accommodate that. So even when I speak to dealers now, a lot of them have planned and put in cables so that they can put in a full range of charging points at some time in the future. So everyone knows it's going to happen and they're going to build it. But in the short term, it's going to be quite difficult in all instances to have enough charging places, or if you're in a situation where you do park on the street, how do you then charge your vehicle, and what happens in those circumstances? Or if you do go on a long trip going from Melbourne to Sydney, and you have to plan around that to accommodate for being able to charge, and even if it's short charging, it will be reasonably difficult. But I think in time those things will improve, so it will get better. So it will become easier for people to do it, and it will become better accepted.
So John, given that we've got a large car park of diesel vehicles, and that car park will continue to grow, even in the short term, where our best-selling vehicles, in this country at least, are diesel, medium pickup and cab chassis, and diesel SUVs. Those cars, we know from our conversations with Ben Sullivan from Potentiate, those cars on average will be 10.5 years of age. So that means that car park's going to be around for a long period of time. In fact, a lot of these cars last out to 20 years. So there will be a substantial market in retrofitting those diesel vehicles with a more efficient technology. Can you tell us about the Blue Flame technology and the opportunities to improve the fuel efficiency and also the environmental score of those existing diesel vehicles, but also marine and commercial vehicles, trucks, etc., with diesel engines?
Well, Mark, the biggest challenge with diesels, and especially when you get to your larger engines like trucks, construction equipment, standby generators, marine engines, locomotives, so all the big engines, a lot of those vehicles are around for 20, 30 years. So even if you stop selling them now, they will still be around for 20, 30 years. And I think at the moment there's around 280 million trucks in the world that are already in existence. So any solution you need to try and find something that's economically worth fitting retrospectively to try and address some of those engines that are already in place, and then to find some sort of solution, because I don't think the electric vehicles have solutions for marine and rail and big engine uses at this stage. There's a lot of work being done on different types of things at the moment, but there's no real good solution yet.
That's the whole idea. So, well, this is where Blue Flame comes into play. This is where you can retrofit your existing diesel engine with a high-pressure diesel injector that increases the atomization of the fuel particles and droplets in the combustion chamber, and you actually go from a yellow flame within the combustion chamber to a blue flame, which is a higher temperature, which means higher energy, less fuel used through better atomization, and you get more power. So that's the beauty of the efficiency of the Blue Flame technology. And it actually negates the need to have the after treatments in the exhaust like AdBlue or particulate filters, because you actually have a cleaner burning fuel. So the industry is pivoting, and there are more options than just the EV option for improving the carbon footprint of the auto car park. So, John, where do you see the opportunities, given we have all these alternative fuels, given the podcasts that we've done and we've spoken to a whole myriad of people, from consumers of V8s, consumers of potential EVs. We've talked to industry experts from a data perspective to see, well, what is actually consumer behaviour current state? What's the purchase intention future state? But also, what are the risks and opportunities for the first people in the auto industry, which are the dealers and the OEMs? But don't forget, the car park, OEMs, and we've been guilty of it, we're good at pumping metal out and just looking at this month's sales results. But realistically, those cars stay on the road for at least 20 years. And we know residual values are important, and we know that operating costs and total cost of ownership comes into play. And this is where the huge aftermarket comes in. So from a dealer perspective, you mentioned that the dealers will be at the forefront of the EV side of the world, or part of this game, where they need to have the EV infrastructure in their showrooms, in their service departments, on their forecourts. That's the story. They sell in the front end. But we know the service business drops away on an EV. So what would you recommend a dealer does, or even someone in the aftermarket? Where are the opportunities for those people when it comes to EVs changing the composition of what's coming into the top of the funnel? And then how do you maintain vehicles on the road in the ICE age, if you like? And we talked about this with the technology and of technicians knowing about ICE and EV. What would be your recommended game plan in that area?
Well, Mark, there's a lot of challenges going to come forward. So you first got the front end part of the business. As you get new brands of EV brands coming into the market, they're probably going to take a Tesla type route. So they'll do some type of agency model where they'll sell the vehicles directly, and they will outsource the servicing to an aftermarket service type network. It's going to mean more competitors can come into the market easily, increasing competition for both existing OEMs and dealers. So that's going to be quite challenging, because your margins are going to be compressed, and you're going to have to look at ways to cut costs, out of the business. And then as a dealer, because you're going to have reduced servicing, a big part of a dealer's business is through his service workshop and the money he makes from that over 8 or 10 years. But a lot of new car dealers, they lose customers after 5-6 years, who then move on to service their vehicles through some aftermarket service outlet. Part of the challenge for a dealer will be, is he able to reposition himself to try and recapture some of that business? So does he take on a aftermarket franchise and position himself into that market, or does he do it through his existing workshops and try and retain those customers for longer periods, which is quite difficult, because sometimes the perception is customers believe they're paying more money for servicing when they come through a service dealer.
The game very much is have that hybrid approach, pardon the pun, where you go the EV at the front end, but then have some mechanism to retain some of that ICE business, because the risks are that the aftermarket ICE players have the potential to come into the new car service side, which is the current domain of the dealers. You've just flagged that there's that potential for the aftermarket to come into the new car market with the new manufacturers coming in.
Yes, that's definitely one part of it. The second part of it is to really start to look at the overhead structures, and is there a way to start reducing and bringing down those overhead structures, moving your service workshop to a lower cost area, setting up maybe test drive and delivery centers in lower cost sites, reducing the size of your showroom footprint, and repurposing some of those facilities, especially if they're in a high cost area. It's very difficult to do that short term, because sometimes you build a building and you have to recover that cost over 15-20 years. That's the normal business model for doing it. But you need to start looking at that now to say, okay, will this business model that I'm in now still be around in 15 years time or 20 years time, and what do I do should that change, or what can I do in the meantime to try and reduce some of those costs or scale things back, which is not an easy task, because if you've bought this massive building, you've put up a big showroom, it's very difficult to repurpose that in the short, medium term. But those contracts will come to an end at some stage, and they should start thinking about some of those things now to plan for the future, because you don't know what's going to happen in 10, 15 years. Whereas previously you knew you could put up a big showroom and you knew you had a 15 or 20 year window to try and recover that investment. Because things are changing so fast, no one's 100% sure whether you've got a 10 or 15 year window to recover that investment now.
And we know from a COVID perspective, with domestic mobility being the mainstay, that international travel or funds that would normally be channeled into international travel are being channeled into either upgrading or maintaining existing vehicles. And we know the car park has gone over 20 million cars for the population of 25 million people, of which just on 20 million can drive cars. So we've got enough cars for everyone who's eligible to drive, notwithstanding the enthusiasts like Silvio who collect 10 cars for his own purpose. So it's an interesting one. It's a dynamic marketplace. Fuel is definitely going to be a big feature of it. When electrification is coming, there's no doubt about it, but it will come at a cost. And it does open up opportunities for businesses at the front, middle and back end of the cycle for vehicles, but also it opens up threats and challenges that need to be addressed at each one of those junctures. Interesting times ahead.
Yeah, it's very interesting and quite fascinating, and I think that's why it's so important to do proper risk assessments before you do any big investments, and try and determine what are the chances of different scenarios happening and what would be the impact to your business if that should happen. And by doing that and doing proper risk assessments will make you more aware of possible risks to the business going forward.
Thank you for listening today. Hopefully you had some thought starters as to where we're going from the fuel type and where the market is going from a technology perspective. A lot of chatter about it, which way we're going to go. Electrification is coming, but do not dispel the other fuel types, which will still be around for a while. We're at 2% at best EVs. That means 20,000 cars. For us to get to 900,000 a year or even 1 million a year, that's going to take a long way, and it will still take some time. It will start to swing in. No doubt the increases will happen. But hopefully the thought starters and some of the questions that we've asked each other, you're asking yourself and you're asking of your own business or you're asking of someone else's business. If you like what you heard, please ring the bell below so you get notifications when we have new shows. Also, follow us on LinkedIn, Spotify and iTunes, and also follow us on our website, which is autocurrents.com.
Well, thanks very much for listening. We'll speak to you again next week.